started. I think we are at slide number 3, I believe.
It took me some time before I realized that it had disconnected because I was in presenter view. So I'm not sure what the last thing was that you heard me say. Was I talking about population growth already?
The slide said you have this Venn diagram, the 3
okay, we'll take it from there.
system. That...
Yeah, we'll take it from there then.
Okay. Thank you.
But I think we were on this slide then. Okay, so
yes, this is the slide. Yep.
Okay, great. So how we see it is that we want many things from food systems, and we think it's useful to think in terms of a triple challenge. We want food security and nutrition and healthy diets for a growing population. We want livelihoods for the people who work on 600 million farms, the people who work in fisheries, but also the people who work on the other stages of the food supply chain. And in addition, we want environmental sustainability. And as if this is not yet enough, we also want resilience around those 3 dimensions, which I indicated here with a little dotted red line. And one of our conclusions is that things are not as black or white as people sometimes make it seem. Sometimes when you read media reports or when you discuss with people, people tend to be either very optimistic or very pessimistic. In reality, it's a little bit more in between. There are some things that have been big successes of food systems as well, but there's also some serious shortcomings that need to be addressed. And the second key point is that better policies can make a difference. And there is a lot of work by the OECD, but of course also by others, that has identified many areas for policy improvement. So to start with one of the successes of food systems, if you go back to the 1960s and you compare where the world is today, world population has more than doubled, but food production has almost quadrupled. So this means that even though the population has increased spectacularly, we have actually managed to produce even more food per person than we did in 1960. And if you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, it was not at all clear that we would be able to do this. People were worried about mass famine and starvation, actually. So people would not have believed you if you had shown them this chart back then. So that is an important challenge which we should not forget. Of course, we also know that even before the current crisis, and then by that I mean the combination of Russia, Ukraine, but also COVID and everything that came with that, even before COVID, actually, we already were losing progress in terms of fighting hunger and undernourishment. And of course, we know that now in the last 2 years, there's been a strong increase in prices. And we talk a lot about Russia, Ukraine. We should not forget that actually prices were already increasing before that. So already before the crisis, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, there was already upward pressure on food prices. In addition, there's also new issues that have emerged compared to the 1960s or 70s. For example, obesity. And as this chart shows, it is not just a rich world problem. It's not just a Western problem. This is something we see all over the world. All over the world, we see this rising trend of overweight and obesity. And there are other issues as well, such as micronutrient deficiencies and so on. So there is still a lot of work to be done to achieve healthy diets for everyone. In addition, food systems are linked to some of the world's most pressing environmental issues. So food and agriculture account for half of all the land use, the majority of the deforestation and the biodiversity loss, the majority of water use and water pollution, and depending on the estimates, roughly 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. And what is interesting is that the vast majority of the damage happens in the farm stage or the step just before that, when people clear land to make way for agriculture. For example, when forests are cut down or when peatland is transformed for agricultural purposes. Now, when we look at land use, so land use is linked to a lot of environmental problems. And what is interesting, if I take back my charts from earlier with the population growth and the food production, is that in the last 6 decades, we managed to almost quadruple food production, but land use increased by about 10 or 15%. So this depends on the estimates. And it's tempting to say almost 10, to say it's only 10%, but we should still keep in mind that because agriculture takes so much space, this 10% is twice the size of Greenland. So this is still an enormous area of natural ecosystems that has been transformed for agriculture. But it is also clear that the food system managed to massively increase the production of food relative to how much land is used. And if we were not able to do that, we would need to take a lot more space and we would have had to convert a lot more forests and other natural ecosystems. So it's an interesting question to ask, how did food systems achieve this? How did we manage to increase the production of food relative to how much land we use? And you can distinguish two big phases there, because initially the main push came from using more inputs, more water, more fertilizer, and so on. So between the 1960s and say 1990, most of the growth in global output came from using more inputs. But interestingly, around 1990, this picture changes, and then you can see that a greater share is due to efficiency gains. It's due to using the existing inputs, the existing material more efficiently. And especially in the last few years, this has become the dominant source of growth of global agricultural production is efficiency gains right now, which is linked directly to your question of the role of science, technology, and innovation. Because efficiency gains depend to a large extent on research and development, and in turn on public investments in agricultural research and development. And the evidence is overwhelming that the world is not investing enough in agricultural R&D. So I'm showing here the results of a relatively recent review that looked at hundreds of studies on the returns to society from investing in agricultural research and development. And they found that the median estimate is that for every dollar or every dollar of public money, society gets $10 in benefits. So these are enormous returns. There is no investor in the world who can boast such nice returns, and yet public agricultural R&D has those returns. And so what that means, you could think of it as good news, that they are very effective and they are very, very powerful tools. But you can also look at it as bad news, because if the returns are still that high, it means that we have for a long time been under-investing in them. And actually the researchers conclude we could easily double the total public investment in agricultural research and development without running out of interesting projects. Efficiency gains have a lot of interesting effects in how they shape food systems. One of them is that if you have efficiency gains, it makes it possible to increase the supply of food and at the same time to lower the cost. And this is actually what has happened over the last few decades. If we take the long-term perspective, we can see that despite the occasional food price crisis, such as the one we are currently experiencing, the long-term trend for food prices has been downward. And our colleagues, my colleagues in the OECD, who work together with the colleagues at FAO to produce the agricultural outlook, they also think that this long-term trend will actually persist, that what we are seeing now is highly disruptive, but that it does not fundamentally change where we see things going in the next decade. That is, that increasing efficiency gains should continue to put us on that path to downward pressure on commodity prices for food. This is great news for the billions of consumers around the world, because it reduces the pressure on consumer budgets. Of course, it poses challenges for farmers, especially for farmers who are not able to keep up with productivity growth and with innovation and efficiency gains, because for them it means that their income is always under pressure. Now, there are, as I mentioned, many important challenges that the world is facing in terms of food systems. And so it is useful to ask, where is the policy effort going today? And around the world, these are statistics from the OECD, around the world, governments are supporting agriculture to the tune of $700 billion a year. And this is not only using public money, it also includes things like trade policies, protectionist trade policies, for example, import tariffs, which protect your domestic producers at the expense of the consumer rather than the taxpayer. And if we look at where the support is going, the vast majority of the support is not really going towards efficiency gains and towards addressing environmental problems and towards stimulating healthier diets. Most of it is going towards supporting the incomes of individual producers. And everything that we would call research and development and other public goods sits in this green box of general services. So you can see that most of the effort is not really going towards providing public goods. Moreover, there are many different instruments you could use to help individual producers. And what we see there is that, unfortunately, most of the money, most of the effort is using some of the most distorting economic instruments, those which are directly coupled to how much is produced. And these have a number of negative effects, both economically, both in terms of international trade relations, but also in terms of the environment and resilience, because they tend to lock farmers into certain production patterns, which reduces their ability to adapt. So in this case, it is easy to see that governments could shift support away from the most distorting measures towards less distorting measures, but also towards investments in public goods, such as research and development. And this would go a long way to addressing problems related to food systems. So in this particular case, the policy recommendations are relatively clear, at least on paper, even if the implementation, of course, is not that easy. But in general, it's not always so easy to derive simple policy conclusions in food systems, because food systems are incredibly complex. As I mentioned earlier, when there is a change happening in one part of the food system, it might simultaneously affect productivity, farmer livelihoods, rural development, maybe the environment, maybe public health. So it is very difficult for policymakers, for innovators, for scientists to find out whether an improvement in one area will actually help to improve things for the system as a whole. And this brings us to the second question, which is, given this complexity, how should we think about making progress? How should we think about making coherent plans? And what we like to do is we hope to make things as simple as possible, but not any simpler. So we've derived a few principles that we hope can help in thinking about these problems. The first one is that historically people have not thought enough about synergies and trade-offs. Historically, for example, agricultural policy was made in the agricultural ministry, and there was not that much discussion or coordination with other ministries. So it is clear that then you will get policies that are not optimizing the performance of food systems as a whole. So policymakers should be aware that there are linkages with other policy areas. But this is just a start, because not every possible spillover is real, and not every theory that we have about synergies or trade-offs is actually true. So for example, in high-income countries, people would sometimes say that the obesity crisis is linked to farm subsidies. It turns out that that is not the case. It turns out that in many high-income countries, the agricultural policies are actually making food more expensive rather than less expensive. So it's an example where people may have the wrong theory in their head about what the synergies and trade-offs look like. So it's important that we are critical, that we are rigorous, and that we evaluate where the real synergies and trade-offs are. Third, sometimes we talk about synergies and trade-offs in food systems as if they are set in stone, as if there is necessarily a tension between, for example, helping farmers and helping the environment. But in reality, it always depends on the specifics, the details of the policy instrument or the innovation or the initiative. To give you an example, some countries use fertilizer subsidies as a way to help the incomes of farmers. And as a result, farmers then tend to use more fertilizer, which then leads to environmental consequences. So in that specific example, there is indeed a tension between helping the farmer and helping the environment. But it is easy to see that you could change the policy instrument to change that trade-off. And you could even imagine paying the farmer for ecosystem services, in which case you might even change it into a synergy. So the devil is in the details. It's important to understand the specifics of the instruments before we talk about the synergies and trade-offs. And when there are synergies, people love synergies, but sometimes we get a bit carried away, we get a bit too enthusiastic. And people sometimes like to search for the one thing that will fix food systems, that will have so many synergies that it solves all of our problems. And unfortunately, this does not exist. But in a way, it's also a relief, because it means that we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we have an innovation or a policy intervention that improves something in one area and that doesn't really make things worse in other areas, it means that we can proceed with that. It means that we should not wait, or we should not cancel a good idea just because it fails to solve all of our problems. Rather, we should think in terms of how do we find the best policy mix that together gets us to where we want to be. And finally, there will always remain some trade-offs, even if we've made a smart choice of our policy instruments. There will always be some trade-offs, and at that point, it is no longer purely a scientific question. Society then needs to make a decision about what to do, and that is a choice which should be informed by scientific evidence as much as possible. But in the end, there needs to be some sort of democratic discussion in society about what society values the most. And that actually brings us a bit to my last point, which is what stands in the way of achieving better policies, and how do we overcome those obstacles? Because we have seen that policies in agriculture and food have often been very difficult to reform. And the way we like to think about it is that this is due to disagreements over the facts, interests, and values. There is a lot we know about food systems, but there is also a lot we don't know yet. There is still a lot of open questions. In addition, in some policy areas, there are gaps between what the evidence says and what people believe is true. So it is important here that we build a shared understanding of the facts through science. But we also know that evidence by itself does not make a policy. And whenever you try to change a policy, it will inevitably benefit some people and it will cost other people. So what this means is that there will always be pressures in society for interest groups, retailers, consumers, farmers, processing companies, etc., to try and influence government and policymakers to change the policy in their preferred direction. And it turns out that this is not necessarily a bad thing, because it can be helpful for government to hear directly from the people affected what would happen if a proposed policy goes through. But it becomes problematic when some groups have more access to the policymakers than others, and especially when certain groups are simply not at the table at all. And almost by definition, some groups are very hard to represent, for example, future generations. So there it's important that we have transparency and accountability to create a level playing field, to make sure that we don't have capture by special interests. But this is only 2/3 of the story. There is still a third element which historically has not been discussed enough, and that is the role of values. And if we think about some of the most difficult policy problems in food systems, they often revolve around values. In many countries, for example, there is controversy around using genetically modified organisms. And there is, of course, a scientific component to that. There is, of course, also an economic interests component to that. But to a large extent, this is also shaped by the different values people may have. And some people may think that it's not correct to be manipulating DNA. Other people might not trust large corporations, and other people might think that we should not find technical solutions for things which are maybe due to social inequalities in society. So it's clear that a lot of ethical components come into play in these discussions as well. And values may sound soft, but in a way they are the hardest of the three. Because when the problem is around facts, you can always do more research. And when the problem is around financial interests, you could in theory find a way to compensate financially the people who would lose. But when there is really a disagreement over values, over what society should do, it's much more difficult to resolve that. And so there are fortunately some new approaches that people are using, such as deliberative processes that seem promising in trying to create more of a consensus in society. So this in a nutshell is the core of our report. And you will see that we spend a lot of time talking not only about the what of better policies for food systems, but also the how of how we should make better policies. And that is not a coincidence, because we do believe that better policy processes are important if we want to make better policy outcomes. So this and much more is included in our report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. And I'm, of course, more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koen Deconinck. He's really set the scene for the discussion very well. The triple challenges of food security, nutrition, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability. We have to approach this problem in a holistic way. And you have discussed synergy and trade-off of different policy choices. Very interesting on the role of STI that has been shifted over time, right? At the beginning, it's focusing on land use, and then we next look at the inputs, right, on water, fertilizer, and recently on efficient grain. And that's a big question on what's next, right? What's the key roles of STI? And I really like that you emphasize on we need to invest in R&D and agriculture, because it's a good investment. Like $1, you get gains of at least $10. That's what we really need. I'm pretty sure that Professor Kraisid would, use this data to support our, agreement for increasing R&D funding, government funding. And you have concluded with this making a better policy. You need to look at the values. Breaking the silos, and in particular, not just monetary values, but on the ethical issue, the inclusiveness and the transparency. And also you need to co-create and engage all the stakeholders, because it's really complex. The system is very complex. Supply chain is very long, and it has impact on, many people, from farmers, consumers, to even small and big firms. And it's regional and also international issues. So yes, I'm going to save the questions and comments at the second round. But if participants have any burning questions, you're welcome to type in the chat box, and I'll try to collect it, and maybe some of the panelists can answer to the chat, but we'll save that during the second round for open discussion. I would like to move on to Mr. Sridhar Dharmapuri from the FAO. I believe that the FAO has been supporting governments around the world in terms of helping with transformation, solving some of the food system challenges. So I would like to, maybe you could share with us the experience from FAO in, this journey, and also maybe suggest with potential collaboration with local and regional partnership as well. I think the floor is yours. We see your slides up, but we cannot hear you, Mr. Sridhar. Can you hear me all right?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was not able to find the unmute button after I had shared the slide. So thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting FAO to this webinar and to be able to share some of our thoughts and ideas on the work that we are doing in the region. So I think Koen has covered the broad issues very well. So, and that saves me a lot of trouble that I don't have to go through that. But we can get to zoom in a little more on the Asia Pacific region. And then in particular, I'll just give you a snapshot of some of the work we are doing in two countries, Bangladesh and Philippines, just to set or show an example on how some of the work particularly in the area of policy making, and also how to influence areas within agri-food systems, which are not really related to food production, but at the same time, they play a very important role in contributing to better livelihoods are actually reflected. So if I can just move the slide. So again, I don't want to go through each and every line, but just to say that this region is incredibly diverse. We've got countries who are members of the G7 or the G8, and we've got members of the G20. We also have countries who are in an acute humanitarian crisis, and and they are classified as in stage 3 or 4 of integrated phase classification for food security. And there are low, middle, and high income countries. We have countries which are aging. We have countries with huge youthful populations. And 74% of the world's family farmers are in this region. And despite everything, despite the economic growth, the industrialization that has happened, more than 2 billion people still derive their livelihoods from agriculture, which has a declining share, progressively declining share in the GDP. And this therefore means that more and more of the farming community have a lower and lower share of the income pie. And that's where we really need to focus. And overall, as we know, the agriculture sector accounts for 40% of global emissions. So reducing the carbon footprint is an important part. Now, within the Asian Pacific, again, not to repeat what Koen actually said, the degradation of natural resources is an issue. So both in terms of soil as well as in water. And this despite the fact that we have 90% of global aquaculture and 50% of global capture fisheries. And we also have the largest share of planted forests. But given the population size in Asia, we're still a net importer of timber. More than 60% of global fatalities and more than 40% of economic losses from multiple hazards, including those which are linked to climate change, actually happen in this region. And just to focus a little bit on the multiple burdens of malnutrition. So whether it's undernutrition, whether it's micronutrient deficiency or obesity and overweight, at this time, we actually have more than 375 million people who are malnourished, and close to about 600 million, or probably more than 650 million people have suffered some kind of food insecurity over the last 2 years in the light of the pandemic. And now that we see that the food price rise has worsened the situation. And our state of food security and nutrition, which the report which we bring out every year, last year it showed that nearly 2 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. And just to put that in perspective, the poverty line is defined as less than $2 a day. The cost of an energy sufficient diet is now reaching $1 a day per person. The cost of a healthy diet has crossed more than $3.75 a day per person. So the chances of a majority or of a huge numbers of the Asian population accessing a healthy diet are very low at this time. And this will actually even worsen the multiple burdens of malnutrition that we have been talking about. And so when we actually want to build on the action streams that were proposed in the through the UN Food System Summit, and you see them here, they are based on the 5 action tracks. And FAO's mission is now guided pretty much by these action streams and to actually implement a more transformational approach for more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems that leaves no one behind. So this is our mission statement for the next 10 years, and this aligns with the SDGs and what we intend to achieve through the SDG agenda for 2030. And not to get in too much into agri-food systems or into the details, but suffice to say that 2 big features. One, there's a lot of interrelatedness, which we are still beginning to understand. And that's a lot of it has happened through the food system dialogues and through the food system summit. But to understand that there are natural elements, societal elements, which are at play, and there are a number of stakeholders, and each of them influence each other in many ways, and we are still finding ways to understand, and that's where the dialogues come in very useful. Second, of course, there are trade-offs, because what we call as a sustainable food systems needs to have positive economic, environmental, and social impacts, but they cannot all happen together. There are trade-offs which we have to deal with, and that is why it's important that a food system transformation pathway takes all this into consideration. So food production has to increase if you have to feed more than 5 billion in this region by 2050 and more than 10 million globally. It has to happen by growing more with less, leaving no one behind, ensuring that everybody gets their fair share both of income as well as of the outcomes of food system transformation. Everybody has access to healthy diets. And of course, all this has to be achieved sustainably with a reduced carbon footprint. So our mission is on focused on the 4 betters: achieving better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life. And all these go together. It's not that one is preferred over the other. When we focus on better production, we need to ensure that we produce nutritious food. We pollute the environment less. We use our resources optimally. We use nature positive production. And all this results in a better life, not just for consumers, but all those who are involved in production, all the family farmers, all the smallholder farmers, and everyone else, society at large. And these are supported by the 4 accelerators that we call them. That's innovation, technology, complements, and data. And I just wanted to just briefly, if I can change the slide, talk about science, technology, and innovation. So we have recently approved what is a science and innovation strategy, which is the first ever for our organization. And I just want to emphasize here that this is not just about technology and digitalization alone. It also talks about and covers all other areas: traditional knowledge, good practices, mechanization, innovation for evidence-based policies and advice. And in Asia, at least, we have generations of know-how and knowledge on agriculture. We've got thousands of years of good practices, particularly in agriculture, to build upon. So those are issues that we always need to consider when we roll out science and innovation in the field. And this is where the role of everyone who's a part of the agri-food system, whether they're smallholders, family farmers, youth, women, policymakers, professionals like us, and the private sector and civil society. That's where all their experience and the knowledge that they contribute it comes into account. So this is the science and innovation strategy. This was approved 2 days ago by the FAO Council. So we are good to go after a year of preparation on the strategy. But a lot of it is based on what's already happening in the field. So I just wanted to give you a snapshot first of Bangladesh, where we have continuously worked with the government on multiple issues, where over a period of time, starting from 2006, when a national food policy was enacted, and it was primarily built on ensuring food security and particularly rice security, which is that's because that's the major staple. And from then, we have progressively covered from food security, moved on to nutrition, to having nutrition-sensitive food systems, to national nutrition plans of action, and the national food and nutrition security policy, and then a plan of action, which is now based on a food systems approach to agriculture policy. And it interacts with other policies such as the health, where there's a major another multi-sectoral program also active for health actions. And then it also interacts with the environment and climate change. So here's a country which has moved gradually from addressing food security as a matter of production to a matter of agri-food systems. And they have created all the institutional mechanisms. I mean, you see a lot of acronyms there, but let me just say, we have the Food Policy Monitoring Unit, we have the Bangladesh National Nutrition Council, and the Bangladesh Food Safety Authority. So 3 issues: food security, food safety, and nutrition, all coming together under a common program. So, and interacting with health at the same time. So this is an example of how a country can adopt an agri-food systems approach and actually focus on all the 4 betters that it wants to achieve. So what has happened overall is there has been a thrust on horticulture, livestock, and aquaculture, which is essentially diversifying production and consumption, and therefore increasing access to a healthy diet. And healthy diet defined the Bangladeshi way. It's a plate that they have adopted for themselves. And nutrition education, which focuses on household, women, and children. The impact has been that undernourishment has decreased by about 8% by over a decade, and child chronic undernutrition by almost 33% in 2 decades. So again, what is important to see is the impact has been very good, but what is again important to emphasize is that this good work needs to continue, particularly under the present conditions when we still have the impacts of the pandemic and the food price rise. So this is a continuous stream of activity. And an example here is of moving our work, which is now moving into urban food systems. So the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka, is one of the most crowded cities on the planet. It has a population of more than 20 million. It's made of 4 city corporations. And we have now a project there where we are looking all together at the 6 clusters, as we call them, or the 6 aims, where we hope that improving food system planning and convergence and governance can increase convergence on many issues: nutrition, food insecurity, food safety, strengthening food value chains. And so for that, we have actually developed the first ever food charters for the 4 city corporations. And this is in order to move towards what we call as an urban food system agenda. But I don't want to go through each and every line here, but just to show that through an urban governance, food system governance approach, you can actually bring about a lot of change, even in cities which are otherwise considered very challenging. Likewise, the Philippines, as part of their food system pathway, have adopted a number of areas that they want to focus on. Food loss and waste is a particularly interesting one, because that's also a way to try and stabilize the prices at this time by ensuring that every country has a better food supply than it already thinks it has, but it actually helps in a way to cut down their import bills as well. So there are multiple steps that are discussed here, but again, I just want to discuss one particular aspect, and this is about the use of agrobiodiversity in traditional agro ecosystem. So this is a project funded by the Global Environment Facility, which we've been implementing in the Philippines, and this focuses on rice, which is again an important part, a staple part of the diet, but where we look at conserving local varieties and using community seed banks. So the communities do the conservation, and in a way they're actually ensuring that varieties and cultivars which are resistant to some of the transboundary pests and diseases that we see right now, that are able to adapt to climate change better, that actually have optimally used resources, are actually conserved and grown, as well as processed and sold in the market. So this is one way to make, this is a way to increase the resilience of agri-food systems, which we are actually now working with the Philippines government on. So these are two examples that I just wanted to show. I will not go into much more detail because I know I've taken up already my time, but just to say that we are now working with the government of Fiji on similar aspects, and Fiji being one of the Pacific islands, we also have both green food, which is agriculture, but we also have blue food, which is essentially the fish. So here again, a multi-sector approach is will be adopted, and in collaboration with the government of Fiji. And I will just stop here, and then we can go back and have a round of questions later. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Sridhar Dharmapuri, very much. Very informative presentation, and Kun Sridhar has shared with us FAO experience in supporting countries like Bangladesh, Philippines, and also touch a little bit on Fiji in doing this transformation, right? On for the food in production, the process, and then how they consume. And I like the idea that you touch on this science and innovation strategy that also take into account this traditional knowledge of indigenous people, you know, that has been practiced and it's proven and it's worked, you know, that combined with new technology and innovation, you know, that would deliver a good solution for each area that fit the context of each country. And the concept of this food charter, very interesting, this social contract, right? It would help a lot in terms of, you know, getting the people to really motivate and drive this change, you know, in addition to just the government policy and, you know, just depending on bureaucratic and government action. So yeah, I got a number of questions for you, but let's come back for the second round. But for now, we'll move on to our third speaker, Professor Dr. Joachim von Braun. Professor Joachim has chaired the scientific group of the UN Food System Summit last year, and I have read your report, very impressive. You know, coordination. You got all the stakeholders, the countries to work together and provide a policy recommendation. So Professor Joachim will share with us these key findings from the UN Food Summit last year. So please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kanchana, for the kind invitation and the introduction. I'm very pleased to engage in this forum with my colleagues Koen, Sridhar, and Kraisid. Kraisid, I look to you as the Asian, at least East Asian leader in nutrition policy. You have achieved so much, keeping us on our toes. Thank you for pushing this agenda. APEC has a key role to play in the current food crisis. Indonesia's presidency of the G20 is of tremendous importance. Thailand's leadership on sustainable bioeconomy and food and nutrition policy in that context, and the science leadership I have observed for the last 2-3 years is of tremendous importance. Let me share my slides and have a brief introduction. So you have asked me to talk about key insights from the Food System Summit that are highly relevant for policymakers and for the general public at large. Let me address these 3 points. I believe we have evidence that the UN Food System Summit advanced food systems thinking. I will talk about that first. then about the main outcomes from science communities for the summit, and considering the food crisis and way forward. Kanchana, you asked us to address that also. What's the meaning of the summit for dealing with the current food crisis? The UN Secretary General has played a key role to drive the UN Food System Summit. There is a very important chair's summary and a statement of action, which Sridhar has already alluded to. We point to the statements of more than 160 member states. So the summit has mobilized national level attention with lots of stakeholders and has triggered commitments. And there is a compendium capturing collective learnings. I point to the scientific group Science Reader, more than 50 papers and consultations, the science dialogues with more than 3,000 scientists on food. We never had such a mobilization of the science community on food issues before. Mobilizing not only the classical food and agriculture research community, but the academies of sciences, the knowledge communities in indigenous peoples communities, the private sector and the civil society knowledge communities. We need to maintain that dynamism. The systems perspective is now broadly accepted, meaning the understanding of the food system not just being a system of supply and demand or consumption and production, but the interactions between consumption, nutrition, and health, agriculture and food industries in their diversities, and with markets, infrastructure and services, and income and employment. I agree with you, Koen, that the food system is really extremely complex, but we need to identify the main building blocks, and we need to model them in order to identify the synergies and trade-offs. I want to underline the point which you made in that respect. It's of extreme importance to guide policies. We also need to be clear on systems which influence the food system, the science and innovation system, most important for our meeting today, indicated here as an ellipse on the bottom right. The science and innovation system, including the basic science, which brings us surprises in genomics, in artificial intelligence, in the understanding of the human psyche, which drives values. Those issues are important for the functioning of the food system. Similarly, the climate and ecology system, the health system, and the economic and governance systems. By the way, we should always talk about plural systems because we have tremendous diversity. So, but I think a major achievement of the Food Systems Summit was that the systems perspective has now arrived here in a simplified way, adaptable to local, national, regional, and global aspects. I reiterate the 5 key points which the UN Secretary General has tabled, which Sridhar has already put up. I think they are very important, and I just want to attest to the fact that it was a major wrestling and complex process to arrive at these 5 key action areas, which the UN Secretary General tabled at the summit. I am underlining point 5, accelerating the means of implementation. It is very important that we come to not just implementation action, but understand implementation as a matter of research, of implementation research. In the food systems context, this is not so well adapted so far. In the health system, implementation research is totally normal since 3-4 decades. So my appeal to you is in the science community, don't leave implementation to the implementers. We have to be on their side and we need to push ourselves to their sides. Then we come to the main outcomes from science communities for the UNFSS, the United Nations Food Systems Summit 2021. These are the 7 key areas, the innovation proposals that we tabled from the scientific group to UN leadership. Number 1, innovations to end hunger and address the availability and affordability of healthy diets. Number 2, the science to de-risk food systems, resilience. Number 3, innovations for efficient and fair land credit and labor arrangements. Number 4, the bioscience innovations for people's health, systems productivity, and ecological well-being. Number 5, technology-based and policy innovations for productive soils, land and water, and to protect the genetic base and biodiversity, including especially the agro-biodiversity. Number 6, fisheries and aquaculture and protection of coastal areas and oceans, so important for the APEC region. This was not just a terrestrial food summit. The oceans, the health of oceans, next week is the UN Ocean Conference. The food systems community and the oceans health related ocean health and aquaculture community need to move much more closely together and draw on the science base together. And 7th, the cutting across digital innovations for efficiency and inclusiveness of food systems and rural communities. Let me highlight an area which caused quite a bit of consternation and of attention, understanding the true costs of food. By the true cost of food, we mean the total cost, including the indirect costs of the food system, indirect costs in terms of environmental damage costs, and the cost to human life and human well-being, health well-being. So the consequences, for instance, of unhealthy diets for lack of well-being and cutting longevity. So the total cost of food in the world markets has been roughly estimated with this preliminary work at $9 trillion per annum. But the true cost of the food system, quantifying with great caution, also the indirect cost comes to about 3 times that amount, 28 trillion. So sustainable and healthy food is too expensive, unsustainable and unhealthy food is too cheap, and we need to better understand the true cost of food and establish steps to internalize these costs in the system, be it through pricing or through other measures. The work on this, by the way, continues, and many countries have started to debate true cost accounting. True cost accounting is also a matter for the business community, and the large Asian food companies have an issue which they may also like to address. I want to point to one other and one other only issue that I want to highlight in view of what we have already heard from Koen and Sridhar. This graph shows you the incremental costs of hunger reduction. A piece of research which we have done in a team with FAO and others in the context of the UN Food System Summit. You see on the horizontal axis the number of people lifted out of hunger from 0 to about 1.1 billion. And on the other axis, the intervention cost per undernourished person. If you look at the first intervention actions, which give you a lot of mileage, meaning a lot of people are moved out of hunger at a low-cost investment, you see that agricultural R&D and its efficiency improvement and ICT, so agricultural information services and better efficiency and all that is low cost and gives you a lot of hunger reduction for 300 to 500 million people, calculated until 2030, this graph. But thereafter, somewhat higher investment costs are to be accepted in order to bring more people out of hunger in an optimal mix of interventions, such as social protection, nutrition interventions, crop protection, soil fertility management. So I don't want to walk you through all this. Infrastructure is particularly important. So we need to look at the whole portfolio of interventions in order to come to least cost approaches, efficiency, and hunger reduction. And we need to talk about investment in hunger reduction because hunger is on the increase. Now, if you look at the UN Secretary General's statement of action, it is for our communities, the science communities, a pleasant surprise how strong science and innovation figures on these 4 pages of the Statement of Actions of the UN Secretary General. I simply highlighted some key points there. Let me just point at the second point. There's also a need to shift and scale public and private financing for food, including for science and research. This innovation and change in financing approaches must avoid excessive hidden costs and support healthier, more inclusive, and more sustainable outcomes. So the UN Secretary General also points at the excessive hidden costs, the indirect costs of food, the true cost of food. So I think there was considerable learning experience, and the UN Secretary General and his team, the Deputy Secretary General and the Rome-based agencies were aligned on that. Let me come to my last few points. Considering the food crisis, let's first look at the preliminary assessment, very brief, of the summit. The summit has some very positive outcomes. Number one, political and societal engagement at scale has happened with hundreds of dialogue events and national planning. The food system focus I mentioned, the science engagement and listening to science engagement at a scale which no summit, after all, this was Food Summit number 7 since 1943. Science has never been engaged so deeply. The action agenda. and the strong emphasis on national level implementation, which I also applaud because food systems require national government's action. But there is unfinished business. And I make 4 points here. Capacity strengthening for national level implementation of actions, especially in emerging economies, has not gotten sufficient attention. Secondly, developing a strong finance agenda for needed investment is yet to come. I point to the Washington-based finance institutions, but also the Asian Development Bank and others, and the private sector. That is unfinished business. The summit came out without a clear financing agenda. Third, establishing improved science policy interfaces so that the interaction between science and policy continues at the level which we had in the last 2 years is not assured. And fourth, facilitating the synergies with other key areas, especially the climate policy, COVID, trade policy, peace and security, and dealing with the food crisis is unfinished business. Up till now, the food and agriculture issues have not been given sufficient attention in the climate conferences, COP26 last year, and this has to change at COP27 this year. And I'm optimistic that food and agriculture will be more on the agenda. We have a complex food crisis now in 2022 because of COVID-19, the Russian war in Ukraine, and the climate disruptions and the droughts. The political responses to this complex food crisis are many, but they are not yet coherent. The UN has established committees and task forces, and I applaud that. It's important. The G7 and G20 have established an alliance for, especially the G7, for food security together with the UN. I applaud that. But the coherence for global policy action is yet to be seen. That the world has drifted again in a major food crisis last year, this year, and this will last into next year, I'm afraid, is indicative that we have a serious governance issue. Superpower food dissonances play a role in it. Governments at national level are to be applauded for scaling up social protection, but many countries have now increased debts, also in Asia. I point to Sri Lanka. Civil society, private sector have their engagements. More is happening there. Consumers' concerns about inflation is there, and I pointed already to the science policy interfaces. Let me conclude with this last point of actions required in response to the global food crisis. There are 5 issues in the short term. Global cooperation to keep food and fertilizer markets open. APEC can play a key role in its region and globally. Grain stock releases are required from those who have stocks in order to calm the markets. Control excessive speculation in food commodity markets through appropriate, not excessive regulation. Short-term shifts in the usage of production by reducing bioenergy use of feed and cutting back in livestock feed use. Taxation of excessive animal products is currently, for instance, debated in parts of Europe. And social protection and nutrition investment actions need to scale up. For the long term, the bottom line is further investment in the food systems infrastructure for resilience and massive increase in R&D for sustainable agricultural productivity. So the insights from the Food Systems Summit: continued need for food systems transformations, accelerated action at national and international levels, strengthening resilience, and the key role of science for sustainable food systems and nutrition. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Joachim von Braun. Very good insights on the summit. I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. You have laid out all the what and the how to. I really like the 7 science and technology proposal that the summit has proposed. I think it's all very relevant, in particular for Thailand and this region. And very interesting stats on this, how to end hunger, the means and the costs. And I think that's provide a lot of a good starting point for us to think about, and in particular, it's linked to Kun Sridhar talk about APEC as the region. We are the net positive, right, for food, and we can be we all together could help contribute and drive this goals of ending hungers, right? But how to do that? And you have touched on the unfinished business that we have to work together, right? It seems to me that it's quite clear on the what and the how to, right? It's raised the question of who has the power to lead this, because we all about the silos across agencies and this effort. Maybe the Professor Kraisid could help shed light on this with his experience working from academia with private sector, international experience, and also now as a senator of Thailand dealing with public policy. I'm very pleased to have you with us today, and maybe you shed light on this. How do we put all these pieces together and sharing Thailand experience in addressing this transformation of food system? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kanchana. Greeting from Bangkok. Essentially, I'm speaking from the Senate office. Joachim, I'm very pleased to see you again, and also glad to learn from Koen and Sridhar. I try to talk about sustainable food system experiences in Thailand. Of course, many issues we are still struggling, try to do better. May I have next slide, please? I think the next slide will show, as you have already mentioned, food and agriculture are fundamental for livelihood, social, cultural dimension, and also tourism. Food, security and nutrition, good health and well-being, and also decent job and economic opportunity, ecological and environmental sustainability, and main contributor for achieving SDG and other SDG. So we have been working along this key objective. And also recently, we try to link food and agriculture to bio-circular green economy model. Next, please. This, again, you have heard already that around 700 to 800 million, now it could be 900 million people are hunger. And also 2 billion of people are suffering from micronutrient deficiency. And also crop and livestock require more than 70% of water withdrawal, and also 30% more in food system. So it will affect global ecology. And agriculture and food system accounted maybe 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas. Food loss and food waste accountable for about 1/3 of all food produced. And again, there is an increasing demand of healthy diet that has been mentioned earlier. With regard to Thailand, next please, 40% of population engaged direct or indirectly in agriculture. But with regard to labor force, it's about 30% of labor force work in food system. as compared to Western society, only maybe 2 to 5%. And even that, we are still fortunate that we still export food ranking number 13. However, productivity is still quite low because of certain government policy try to guarantee income, guarantee the price. It's kind of a little distortion that has been mentioned earlier. And also food productivity or agriculture productivity increased only 1.9% per year. Next, please. Since I have been a member of a National Food Committee, I have been working for the last 10 years or so as a chairman of planning committee. We try to use holistic approach and emphasize on management for achieving food security and nutrition, number one. Number two, food safety and also quality with premium quality for the consumer. And third, research, education. The fourth, management. As you see in this diagram, agriculture will cover food and non-food production. We try to emphasize that at farming, we try to create zoning based on production, history, and also potential of production. Again, based on data information. We emphasize on farmer, smart farming. That also require a lot of technology. Since we would like to have food safety and quality, we emphasize on good agriculture practice to increase productivity and also to trace back the product. With regard to processing, we emphasize at household, at a village or tambon, and SME and also industry. Consumption at service outlet in school, in restaurant, and also workplace. And next, at the end, we emphasize on consumer health and well-being, environmental sustainability, economic and prosperity. So we emphasize a great deal on consumer demand, that food system that produce safe food, premium, and nutritional quality. Next, as you see here, we also emphasize many key factors that you have already mentioned about the value chain, logistic efficiency, because Thailand use a lot of locomotive, not a rail system or water system. So logistic is up to 12 to 15%, very expensive. And again, we have a lot also of food loss and waste, similar to FAO estimate, around 30%. We also emphasize on multi-sectoral. This is very difficult to have policy coherent. And however, we try to emphasize on multi-stakeholder approach. We call 5P, public, private, professional, people partnership. And we also try to work with private sector, big company, that if the farmer produce high quality product, they should have a fair income for their product. And below this next piece, we emphasize a lot on science, technology, research, and innovation. But I must say that research support in Thailand has been rather low. The government provide input maybe 0.8% of GDP, and then private sector come in around not quite 1%. In general, research, overall research still quite low, and agricultural research also quite low. We try to push this. Then we also try to emphasize on area-based or setting-based. In other words, land use theory based on the king. That we use the king to produce integrated farming system, water for aquaculture, 30% of land can be used to grow staple like paddy, 30% to grow fruit and vegetable, 10% for for living area or house. And then we also emphasize on capacity building through university and engaging university for development with monitoring and evaluation. Next, please. Next. Ultimately, our goal of food and agriculture system is for food security and nutrition. With regard to nutrition, we are facing more overnutrition, obesity, overweight, starting from childhood period. For undernutrition, it's very minimum now. Stunting has been also improved slowly, still a problem. And NCD has been rising. We also try to encounter that. And then economic opportunity, linking with local product and opportunity. And then environmental sustainability that I will mention later on. Social cultural tourism. Next. We lately try to link agriculture and food system to bioeconomy development model. I'll start with B first. We try to emphasize high value added. Again, it corresponds with the plan that we have set out. Premium quality, safe, high nutritious food and product, meeting food standard. Meeting food standard is still a major problem that we have to encourage farmer and food producer to comply with this. And then also with local innovative product or produce ingredients for consumer. At the end, we would like to have more to improve productivity, efficiency throughout the food chain. And we try to increase farmer access to knowledge and technology and promote sustainable agriculture. If they have good business plan, we work with the agriculture bank to have a soft loan for them. Next, please. I just give you one example that have received high attention. It's a riceberry. This riceberry has been developed by one professor from Agriculture University. And subsequently, there are a lot of research by a research institution and also university identify that this riceberry has high nutritional content, including antioxidant, vitamin, mineral, and GABA. Next, please. Riceberry can also be used as food, flour, pasta, can be used as a drink, alcoholic drink, and also make it like a coffee imitation, and also can be used as a cosmetic, even produce alcohol, and also a food supplement. Rice bran oil has been quite popular, and also rice fiber. So riceberry has been popular not only in Thailand but also in Japan. Next, please. With regard to circular economy, we try to promote and create awareness that we have to reduce food loss and food waste. But as you know, in a developing country, food waste is not much as food loss. So we have to combine and then to reduce both loss and waste, and reuse of food packaging and food contact material such as plastic. I think we have to learn from Germany how to manage this waste of food contact material. And we try to emphasize about recycle of byproduct or waste converted to value added produced by research and technology and innovation, like biofertilizer. This is a big area. Biofuel have been implemented. Biodegradable food contact, we have to do more. And then food ingredient as a food supplement, I will show you. Next, please. I have been a consultant advisor to Thai Union also that they have the aim to produce food supplement for being high value added. Like now they have tuna calcium and also tuna collagen and tuna head fish oil and also hydrolysate is kind of drink. And also eggshell also can be used as a biocalcium and also eggshell membrane. This is just example. Next, please. With regard to green economy, I think we have to promote more. Focus on ecological and environmental sustainability. For example, reduce and neutralize carbon footprints, conserve and reuse of water, use of renewable energy, and also use of biodegradable recycled food packaging and food contact material. And eventually, we have to protect and conserve forests and biodiversity with people participation. For example, economy under the forest. I think at the Inter-Parliamentary Union, Germany member parliament promote to work on this issue, carbon credit and forestry. I think this is a very important issue because Thailand has around 30 to 32 forests. We would like to move up to 55%. And then also we work on so-called carbon credit so that we can neutralize carbon production. And then people can live in the forest to grow and protect forests at the same time earning income from growing something else, including promote tourism. Next, please. With regard to research and development and innovation, waste material, including water, will be treated and can be used as a biogas, biofuel. And also the solid and water part after treatment can be used as organic fertilizer. For example, factory that produce amino acid in Thailand, they treat the waste and use for organic fertilizer. And also water after treatment can grow seaweed. And also seaweed can be used for livestock. This just give you example. Research and innovation have been going on. I believe if we have more funding and have more collaboration, we can achieve more. Next, please. NASDAQ also promote research BCG model in 5 provinces. I just show you one province, Ratchaburi, is about 70 kilometers from Bangkok. They have a good coconut, so they try to promote aromatic coconut and try to emphasize the concept of BCG model, as I mentioned to you. And also pig, try to manage in a systematic way about pig production and also caring for environment. And then also organic agriculture product that again based on agriculture waste. In that area also growing a lot of sugar cane. So try to reduce waste from sugar cane to produce something else. And also in that area also have cattle. The waste from cow it has to be used for biogas and also fertilizer. Next, please. So in conclusion, we have applied BCG economy model to guide transformation of food and agriculture for achieving SDG, strengthening our national food policy, and hopefully it will enhance of facilitate achieving SDG, not only number 2, but number 1, number 3, 7, 8, 12, 17. And key success factor, as has been mentioned by previous speaker, human resources, and also research and development, particularly in science, technology, and innovation. And then, of course, we always wish to share and learn from other countries. I think APEC try to, Thailand hosts APEC. We try to promote food sustainability or sustainable food production or sustainable food system along with BCG. With that, I think in my presentation, and would like to acknowledge the 2 or 3 persons that helped to improve my slide and make it look much better than the original one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kraisid, very much for sharing with us Thailand BCG model or bio-circular and green economic model. It's now become a common word in Thailand right now because it's our new growth model for post-COVID recovery and future growth, and it has been applied to different sectors, and also, as Professor Kraisid has shared with us, and also in area-based as well. You know, Radburi model. Radburi is one of the provinces in Thailand. We also have BCG model at the regional level, the north, the south, the northeastern. So this is some action that has been taken, and we would very pleased to share with our friends in APEC and other interest party as well. The BCG agenda, Thailand will also take as one of the agenda that we share in different forums in APEC, and hopefully we'll have. I guess we are developing a Bangkok goals on BCG that we'll share with other APEC members. So great. I guess with my 4 speakers, we have set the scene on this transformation of the system, like to cope with all these challenges, and have highlights on the what to do and how to. So let's open up for questions and comments. Let's see. I have in this chat box from Kun Sirikan asking about the downward trends of commodities, right? But recently with the crisis, the conflict, Russian-Ukraine conflict, it seems like the price going up, increasing. So is a long-term trend, or how would it have impact on food price? And I think Dr. Koen has answered that. Anyone like to touch on this? Or maybe Dr. Koen, you want to elaborate a little bit more from the answer in your chat box?
Sure. Well, it's clear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has a massive impact, and nobody has a crystal ball, so it is difficult to say when this conflict will end and what the consequences will be. So that being said, if we compare, for example, with the food price crisis that happened around 2006, 7, 8 until 2011 and 12, also at that time we had high and volatile prices. There were clear reasons why there was such a high price and such high volatility. But in the end, the ongoing productivity gains in agriculture kicked in at some point, and again brought us back on a downward path of prices. And so our colleagues in OECD work jointly with the colleagues at FAO every year to produce the OECD FAO Agricultural Outlook report, which takes a 10-year horizon. And so the new version will come out, I think, in the next week or the next 2 weeks. And so I had conversations with my colleagues, and they say that the judgment at the moment is that this disruption at some point will again pass. It's not yet clear how long it will be, but at some point the disruption will pass, and we should probably resume, at least for the next few years afterwards, again that downward trend. So that being said, of course, nobody has a crystal ball, but it means that there are bigger fundamental long-term trends towards efficiency gains. And the idea is that that would actually at some point take over again.
Okay, anyone want to touch on this issue as well?
Make a brief comment. I think of course, everybody in the world suffer from this, more or less, depend upon the socio-economic and the setting, the context. In Thailand, we also suffer because of food price rising also, food and fuel. And
fertilizer too.
Yeah, fertilizer. I
Yes.
try to mention that four F start with fuel, and then feed, and then fertilizer, and end up food. And with regard to food, I think the group that suffer most is dairy worker. Income, their income by every day. If there is no job, they will not have food to eat unless there is a social protection. In this regard, I think people who are living in rural area under subsistence economy may suffer, but not as bad as dairy income worker. So it requires social safety net, maybe the help from the family, help from temple, religious organization, and the government itself. So I end up here for a brief comment on food crisis.
I would like to very much agree with the point on the need for strengthening safety nets and combining them with nutrition and health action. On the prices issue, we must be reminded that yes, calories have become cheaper over the last 6 decades or so, but healthy food has become more expensive.
Yes.
If you look at the prices of fruits and vegetables in particular, pulses, they do not follow this trend. At least the numbers which I have seen from South Asia point into a different direction. So healthy food has become more expensive in many parts of the world, and that needs to change. The affordability of healthy diet and not the commodity price trend is what we need to focus on.
Good.
Yes, any questions or comments from the audience? Please feel free to raise your hand. I don't see any hands. Maybe I can follow on this issue of the food shortage and, you know, this from this shock. And we see the trends of decoupling of supply chain, you know, food supply chain. How do you see this? Is it just a short-term kind of phenomenon, or you think it would have some sort of long-term impact as well on the food supply chain? Anyone would like to touch
a word
on this?
Briefly, but my colleagues have also for sure ideas. I am afraid that currently, again, trust in trade has been undermined, and undermining trust is difficult to correct quickly again. So the more than 20 countries which have established trade restrictions, export restrictions of different kinds, have neighbors who will not forget so quickly. So I think we will see a loss in efficiency because countries will focus more on self-sufficiency rather than trust in trade. That is not good. That's why the current World Trade Organization's discussions are so important. We need good globalization in the food system with attention to resilient value chains that are not too dependent on one supplier or one bottleneck, but political leadership, and Asia can be at the forefront of that, needing to re-establish trust in markets and trade.
Thank you. Anyone would like to add on this issue?
Maybe add on. You see, when I was working at FAO, I tried to understand the main cause or main root cause of food insecurity. Number one that we are facing now is conflict and war. It happens everywhere in every continent in the world. Maybe it's a small pocket area. Number two is a disease. But at that time, I had the impression of disease in plant, in animal, or fishery. But now it's a human disease, emerging disease, could be a major problem also. And then again, as Joachim mentioned about trade restriction, that creates some kind of chaotic situation in many parts of the world. And then as individuals, when they are nervous, they also try to overstock. That again create more a problem that even more difficult to solve. So just would like to remind that it's very complex issue.
Yes. Okay. Let me come back to the key points that we would like to discuss today. Is on the role of science and technology. I know that science technology is cross-cutting innovation. That's not just the technology but also management as well. So maybe I would like to deep dive into this food crisis. Supply chain, improve productivities, more responsible in production and the production and consumption. And maybe if you want to add on to this transformation to carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, perhaps we could discuss in depth in terms of what's everybody say that it's crucial role. Science, technology, innovation play a crucial role in helping us transform to achieve this goal. And anyone would like to add on into what would be the holistic system approach of science and technology? And I would like to also discuss on the who. It's so complex system and problem. Who need to take the leadership in moving through this journey? Anyone would like to touch on that?
Can
and the who and the role of science and
with
technology.
your brilliant idea and experiences.
Please, Professor Kraisid, please go ahead.
No, I would like to have Professor Joachim to start with his
Okay.
brilliant idea. Yes.
Yeah.
Professor Joachim,
you always,
please.
Kraisid, you always push the difficult questions to me. It is good to work with you. Let me be serious.
Is the Prime Minister just the one that has taken to? Okay, please.
Let me be serious. I think it is extremely important that we find productive alliances. I am pleased to see how the United Nations work with G7 on the Food Security Alliance, and how G7 and G20 interact on that this year. Germany is president of G7. Indonesia is president of G20. So I see productive cooperation and together with the United Nations. I think we need to have such alliances. What I feel regarding the WHO, Kanchana, is also very important to have committed private sector involvement, and both in terms of financing, but also in terms of sharing knowledge and getting things done, including the production systems and value chains that serve low-income people. So at the national level, I find it important that the WHO includes ministers of agriculture, nutrition, and health ministries, and top-level political leadership for the food systems action. So I would wish that all countries who have, all 163 countries which have tabled a plan in the context of the Food Systems Summit, now have round tables and bring in to these tables the science community, and not just the practitioners, but the applied science of food, nutrition, agriculture need to have a seat at the table to address the synergy and trade-off issues in practical ways, which Koen mentioned earlier.
Great. Okay. Finally, I see names, right? And I like the idea of forming this alliance that have different stakeholders, right? Starting a platform to share, to discuss, maybe a forum like this, we engage more people and everybody bring in action, right? We need collaboration and we need to take action too. Sridhar, I saw you type something in the chat. Would you like to elaborate on that?
So I have just typed in the link. Sorry, it took me a while to figure this out, but I've typed in the link to the FAO webpage, where you have all the details of the responses. One is, of course, the humanitarian response to the war in Ukraine, but the other part is the what are the kind of actions on the ground and the responses that countries can deliver to mitigate the negative impacts on global food security. So there's data analysis, policy documents, recommendations, policy briefs, and so on. So are there, so you can always go through them, and in many ways they will cover the points that Professor von Braun actually mentioned, but also others, and also about what the kind of different kinds of local responses that can be developed. So there's a wide, there's quite a menu of them. What's important is that they need to be coordinated. They also need to be, in a way, they need to have a positive face and not a negative face like we have in case of export and trade restrictions. And this is also then, so there is the short-term response, which is on keeping trade routes open, on investing more in social protection. And social protection was one of the success stories during the pandemic in large parts of Asia. In fact, countries which otherwise did not have very successful social protection programs realized their value, and they are continuing. So that was a positive outcome from the pandemic, and which is being continuously implemented. And then there are other recommendations also on diversification, both in terms of in agriculture itself, but also in terms of where countries import their food from. And of course, then there are the longer term actions which we have discussed and which we've heard during the 4 talks that we had on agri-food system transformation. So there are both short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures which can actually help us to address this situation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me join in with talking about science, technology, research, and innovation.
Please.
You see, as Koen mentioned earlier, a lot of coherence, particularly policy coherence. So in this area also, I think it requires policy coherence among various ministries, from agriculture, and then health, higher education, or even some country may have the Ministry of Science and Technology. So policy coherence in this area. Look at the holistic throughout the food chain, agriculture, food system, up to health, nutrition, health, and also environment. So it requires a lot of research. For example, start with food chain. We have to look at the soil quality, history of use, and then look at water quality, and then climate, that appropriate for certain food production or not. And then when it comes to plant and animal, it requires genetic resources research. For example, you can produce a certain kind of fruit like a strawberry with very good genetic resources. The same thing for lemon or whatever. Then the genetic resources of plant and animal, and then nutrition of plant and animal, and then disease prevention and control. Then come up to good practice, good hygiene practice, and then they come up with the primary product quality and safety. I'm talking about the food chain concept based on Codex Alimentarius principle. And then once you have primary material, then you need to have those good product, healthy product to consumer. And then at industrial level, it requires also good manufacturing practice. And as Joachim mentioned, I really impressed that the concept unhealthy food are cheap, unhealthy diet, but healthy diets that we can produce more and more become more expensive. And of course, if we combine this, look at the so-called system thinking, starting from policy coherence. But I learned lately that whatever people talk at high level, it requires implementation at local level. Farmer, group of farmers. And then those farmers have to work with private sector, or private sector have to engage farmer, support them with research innovation, and then pay the farmer more when they produce high quality and safe product. And then the private sector also have to apply the concept of BCG model, make the environment green. Of course, they cannot do alone. They have to work with farmer or group of farmer. So those are my current thinking: policy coherence, and then action at local level, engaging multi-stakeholder at the top and at the same time at local community.
Yes, I couldn't agree more on policy coherence, in particular things that, we need to work across the whole supply chain, the whole ecosystem, right? That's, so many agencies and ministries responsible. Maybe follow on to that. What would be the key enabler? We discuss a lot. We want to break the silo, and how do we, what are the incentive, the key enabler for different ministry to work together to have a coherent policy, and also to get the farmers, the SME motivated, to change. This costs money too. How anyone want to touch on the enabler on a policy and also implementation level? Koen, I see you.
It's a challenging question. I don't think any country has already figured it out. And even high-income countries are still struggling with this because historically it was all focusing on agriculture alone, right? And I think one of the challenges is that our educational systems, our own educations, train us to be specialists. We become agronomists, we become nutritionists, we become supply chain managers, etc. So it's difficult for any one of us to see all these synergies and trade-offs ourselves. So things that I've been wondering about is whether we need more interdisciplinary education in the schools about food systems. Do we need to set up maybe even exchange programs where people from one ministry spend 1 year in a different ministry working on a completely different issue, where you have people who are trained in food safety who then have to work on etc. Just to get the thinking and to make more connections, and so that people also automatically get to know the different communities and talk to each other more. I think it's still an open question, actually.
I think there are positive and negative enablers. Positive is political leadership's wisdom and due process in participatory democracies and in countries that care for people, for their people. So I point to leadership, be it in senates or in top-level government. But currently, I think we see a lot of negative enablers, and that is political leadership feels threatened and sees political risks for political stability in the current food crisis. So both negative and positive enablers make me optimistic that we are going to see policy change. In 2010 and 11, we had food riots and uprisings in more than 60 countries, and political leadership have not forgotten that. And these political upheavals happened at price levels and price volatility. It's not only levels, the volatility, which irritated people. So I think we will see some coherent, at least the attempt to coherently act on the food crisis. But in the way is the very complex and very sad war in Ukraine, the attack by Russia on the Ukraine, which blocks trade flows, and the conflicts in many other areas of the world. It's not only Ukraine; it's also parts of Africa and the Afghanistan problem. So we need to see food security on the agenda of the diplomats and the security-oriented policymakers.
Thank you. It's already 3 p.m. in Thailand, and my team has said that time is up. But I guess if we can have for 5 more minutes, I want to have a final round for all panelists to maybe sum up a key message to policymakers or to say our leaders on this transformation of food system. What would be your key message to them in 30 seconds, I would say, please. And anyone would like to start? Koen would like to start?
Well, I'd like to get back to the theme of science and technology, and we've spoken a lot about the crisis that is happening right now, but we should not lose sight that investing in science, technology, innovation, these are long-term investments, right? So we need to take a long-term perspective as well. And so the studies I mentioned earlier that show $10 of benefits for each dollar invested, those $10 happen over many, many decades. So it's a calculation of all the future streams, and sometimes it's over 20, 30 years that these benefits continue to accumulate. So it's very important that there is a crisis right now, but we should not expect miracles tomorrow to solve this crisis from innovation today. These things take 10 years or so.
Thank you. Sridhar, please.
This is 3 words: inform, reform, and transform. So inform with through partnership and by learning from all the stakeholders in the process. The Food System Summit kick-started that how this can be done. Second is to reform, and the reform doesn't have, it depends on the country how they want to do. There are various ways to cut the cake. There's no one size fits all, but adopt in principle how ministries, agencies, and all the sectors can coordinate together. And the third is to implement the transformation. I think the goals are very clear. So it's about finding the right ways in every country, which fit for purpose pathways for each one of them. I stop there.
Good. Thank you. Joachim?
Well, APEC policymakers, bring your science community to your tables. They're ready and will give you good advice. Bring the diverse science community to your tables.
Yes, thank you. And Professor Kraisid, ka.
Yes, I think there is a need to link macro policy to action at community by empowering people with knowledge, wisdom, and also technology, not just as paying them money with a subsidy or right price guarantee. Of course, that policy can be done, but some portion of those money, those policy from those policy can be used for empowerment, capacity building with knowledge, wisdom, and technology for sustainable food system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have a very rich discussion, very vibrant, a lot of information, and it's a very good kickstart the discussion, the regional dialogue. The team will, summarize all the key points and recommendation, and we will also, forward this to the second dialogue. I believe it would be next month. Please stay tuned. I think July 6th, right? We will deep dive into the STI, the key technology. I have looked through the program. They're going to talk about like new cutting edge technology like genomics or even synthetic biology and all that. Some of the new digital technology. So please stay tuned, our audience, for the second policy dialogue on this series on food systems. And I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Koen Deconinck, Mr. Sridhar Dharmapuri, and Professor Joachim von Braun and Professor Kraisid Tontisirin very much. And also my co-host, our co-host, NASDA, National Science Technology Development Agency, and also NXPO. We would like to, and also the team for preparing for this session. Once again, I think the team has put up in the chat box that they would like to hear your feedback on this. Please, it wouldn't take long, maybe 1 minute. Please fill up the evaluation form. And the slides will also, I think we get permission from our panelists to share the slides with the audience. So they will send all the PowerPoints, the PDF file of the slides to you, to your emails that you have registered with us. So with that, I conclude this session. Thank you very much again. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.